There's the hypothesis that, Jesus was, died and came back to life after the harrowing of hell or whatever it is that's supposed to have happened during that period. Another hypothesis that really he was Satan, or that he was Father Christmas or an elf, or all of these hypotheses on the face of it are equally likely in advance. So once you're allowing for one miraculous explanation, you can allow any miraculous explanation. And so even once the miraculous is on the table, there's no special reason, I think, unless you've got some ancillary evidence, and you might have, but in the absence of any ancillary evidence, simply saying a miracle occurred gives you no particular reason to think this or that or your favorite miracle occurred.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Arif Ahmed. He is professor at the University of Cambridge, and he is reader in philosophy at the University of Cambridge, and is Nicholas Sallnow-Smith Lecturer in philosophy at Gonville and Caius College. His work focuses on decision theory, philosophy of religion, Wittgenstein, and some other related topics. His books include Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, a Reader's Guide, Evidence, Decision, and Causality, and among some others, his new book for Cambridge Elements, Evidential Decision Theory. Feel free to add anything, but welcome and thanks so much for being here, Dr. Ahmed.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Right, yeah. For those interested, you can also check out the previous interview we had with Professor Ahmed a few months ago. So I wanted to start out with some questions related to philosophy of religion. And one, I recently watched the debate you had a few years ago now, I guess something like maybe 10 years ago now, with Gary Habermas on the resurrection of Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I found that very interesting, and agreed, pretty strongly with your overall approach. I was wondering what you think of the following sort of response, though, which is maybe what Gary was getting at, or at least in the spirit of some of his responses. So we might grant that on its own, the truth of the resurrection and like a body passing through solid rock is less likely than the falsehood of the testimony, right? But that the best explanation of like Christian religious experiences and other occurrences more broadly includes the occurrence of a genuine miracle here, not the falsehood of the testimony, if that makes sense. What do you think of that sort of approach?
Yeah, I suppose you can distinguish between dimensions in which an explanation is good. So you might say you can have an explanation that's good in the sense that it gives a satisfying account of a whole range of phenomena, or it unifies them somehow, or it makes them really likely, and it's a kind of interesting story. All of those things might be, desiderata that makes an explanation good. And in those dimensions, I can imagine saying that there was some miraculous occurrence, I guess, would score quite highly. And in that, therefore, could be a good explanation of the phenomena you described. So some of the phenomena we were focusing on, Gary and I were focusing on in that talk, as you say, was testimony by witnesses or alleged witnesses to those events, or people who'd heard from the witnesses to those events. But if you think about religious experiences and various other things, you might think, well, that's the best, some miraculous occurrence is the best explanation. But I think a very important factor when assessing explanations is how likely they are in advance. So if you start out thinking that, for instance, some kind of hallucinatory event, some sort of brain event and so on, is a more likely explanation than a much more likely explanation than, say, a miraculous event, then that would have to count in favor of it. So, clearly, if you're Bayesian, for instance, the prior that's much more likely in advance is going to get weighted much more than all of these competing explanations. So in the end, I think even the fact that those explanations are better along one dimension doesn't mean that they're going to be the best explanations along all the dimensions.
Right, so you're saying that, like, for what the discussion was about, just on like this particular testimony in mind here regarding the resurrection, we don't have that testimony doesn't warrant belief in the resurrection and the body passing through rock and so forth.
Yeah.
But I guess you leave it open then that there could be further testimony or facts which do count in favor of it, or
in principle there could be, yes. I mean, I think you can't say a priori there could never be a case where the evidence, doesn't make it the most likely explanation or make it the best hypothesis. But I do think that there is something in Hume's remark that in those cases, it's got to be more miraculous that the evidence is misleading than that a body passed through rock or whatever else. So it's got to be a case where you kind of know in advance that something miraculous occurred. Where by miraculous, however, I just mean something that's really, really unlikely in your priors. That's all. Because I think the argument, I mean, the Humean argument that I had in mind and that I was sort of pushing when I discussed it with Gary, as I recall, it was some years ago, was basically against miracles, not conceived of in any specifically religious sense, but simply miracles in the sense of things with really, really, really low priors. That's all. And if that's what you take miracles to be, then I think the argument holds good. But it's consistent with there being some kind of evidence. I don't think it's very likely, and it's hard to imagine what it would be, but some kind of evidence that could significantly raise the probability of even a person coming back from the dead.
Right. Yeah, because I think what he might have wanted to appeal to, try to appeal to in that debate was near-death experiences, and I guess theism more broadly. But that's not the sort of thing that would be sufficient for that, you think, or?
Yeah, I rather doubt it. I mean, partly because there's relatively little that we know about near-death experiences. We can imagine that there's all kinds of other scientific explanations for them. There's no special reason to think that those near-death experiences really are themselves anything supernatural. But even setting that aside, there's a big difference between a near-death experience, which is one thing, and a bodily resurrection, which is another thing. So there might be experiences where you have a kind of some sort of cessation of your heart and so on, and then you have some kind of weird experience, and then your heart starts up again. That's one thing. Very different from a person, hanging on a cross for several hours, dying, being buried, and then coming back to life 3 days later. So I think even if we think something funny is going on with near-death experiences, there's no reason to think that the funny thing going on there tells us much about the funny thing that's supposed to have been going on, during the resurrection.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, two things I want to note on that. First, yeah, even if we did have some reason to think that there's some cases where, there's strange near-death experiences, or maybe some cases where people are dead for a bit and would come back to life, it's still going to be very unlikely, taking some particular case, that's going to be like that, right? It's still a very rare occurrence that people would come back to life, let alone come back to life after this time and pass through rock and so on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
right.
the effect of it, I guess, would be to somehow to raise your priors that was the explanation, because you might say, well, look, it's happened sometimes. But of course, it's still vastly less. It's vastly less frequent than the fact that you and I have observed many times, which is that people make mistakes, people lie, people exaggerate stories for effect. All of these things. This is things anyone can observe every day. Neither resurrection nor even near-death experiences are things that most of us have observed ever, let alone every day.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to note on near-death experiences specifically, I recently talked with John Martin Fisher and independently Benjamin Mitchell Yellen, and they've done some work on near-death experiences, including writing a book on it, where they're pretty critical of inferences made from studies on near-death experiences to things like the immateriality of the soul or something like that, where
indeed.
Yeah.
So having said that, I mean, the immateriality of the soul is one thing, but I assume that if we're talking about bodily resurrection, which was that, what I guess Gary was arguing for, I mean, that's consistent with rejecting dualism, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, that's fair enough. Although maybe that would help with regards to passing through solid rock, but I don't know if it's a miracle. Who knows? I guess a lot of things are.
Well, indeed, that's right. Well, that was one of the things I remember arguing towards the end of my argument against Gary. I can't remember exactly how I put it, but the point was just once you're in the market for the miracles, as you say, everything's on the table. So we've still got infinitely many, or uncountably many, or whatever, very many hypotheses. No one of which is more likely a priori than another. So there's the hypothesis that Jesus was died and came back to life after the harrowing of hell or whatever it is that's supposed to have happened during that period. Another hypothesis that really he was Satan, or that he was Father Christmas or an elf, or all of these hypotheses on the face of it are equally likely in advance. So once you're allowing for one miraculous explanation, you can allow any miraculous explanation. And so even once the miraculous is on the table, there's no special reason, I think, unless you've got some ancillary evidence, and you might have, but in the absence of any ancillary evidence, simply saying a miracle occurred gives you no particular reason to think this or that or your favorite miracle occurred.
Right. And I think one you mentioned there was, well, suppose that you have some 513 person hallucination. Consider that as maybe that's a miracle explanation.
Yeah.
Well, why is that any less likely than the one than the miracle they're proposing, right? The resurrection.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. I did want to ask, so you did have I think it's a forthcoming paper on religious belief. And in that you defend the somewhat provocative idea that most religious people, or at least many of them, do not in fact have religious beliefs. They lack one or both of two features you take to be required for genuine belief, the penetration and evidentialism. Could you talk about this a little bit and the point you're making here?
Yeah, sure. As you can imagine, for a long time, for most of my adult life, I've been a fairly uncomplicated atheist, and what that means is that I understood religion to involve belief in things that are false, and against which there's very good empirical grounds. Now, I do still think that the propositions of religion are false, and I do still think there's strong empirical grounds against them, but I'm rethinking to some extent how widespread is something worth calling belief in those propositions. I do agree there are people all over the world, perhaps in more extreme religious communities, they're more frequent, but not just there. There are people in the world who really do sincerely believe these things. But I've come to wonder to what extent most, perhaps what you might call most mainstream Christians, or perhaps even Muslims or Jews, believe some of the things that I think are supernatural and false. And my thinking behind that is based on the way I kind of think about belief. And that sort of builds on a Wittgensteinian way of thinking about the mind and about belief. So what is it to be a belief? What makes a state of belief? Now here, I'm inclined to be sympathetic to a sort of roughly Lewis-style functionalism about it. So what makes a state of your brain? Your brain's in a certain state. When does that state get to count as believing something? Well, we have to look at, its behavioral effects, and we have to look at its causes. So Lewis says, for instance, pain is the kind of state that is caused by bangs to the head and causes you to say ouch and run away. Right? That's what pain is. So that's a functionalist view about what makes a state of the brain a pain. Similarly, you might say about belief, what makes a state of the brain a belief is to do with the causes and effects of it. So that it's, whether it's caused by exposure to certain kinds of evidence and so on, and its effects are essentially decision theoretic. That is, its effects is that combined with your desires, it ends up producing certain kinds of behavior. Okay, that's roughly speaking what beliefs are. Now, I combined that with, that's all reasonably Lewisian, but I also have a sort of Wittgensteinian view about these things, which is that the inputs and outputs by which you specify whether a state of the brain gets to count as a belief are probably vague. There's no one thing they may all have in common. There's a very large range of very different sorts of states of behavior and states of inputs by which we qualify something as a belief. And so whether something gets to count as a belief is in some ways a vague matter. And perhaps it might even be an undecidable matter. So let's say if we have a person, who will say it's raining, but they won't take their umbrella, okay? And, they learnt it by looking out the window, or they looked out the window when it wasn't raining, for instance. But they will say things like, well, don't go out because it gets wet, let's say, but they wouldn't bet on the proposition that it's raining. So some of their behavior is consistent with the belief that it's raining. Other behavior isn't. Do you want to say that they believe it? Well, that seems to me like a case where, like, as Wittgenstein said, you can say what you like as long as it doesn't blind you to the facts. But the facts are, this person's in a certain brain state. That brain state has certain kinds of causes. It has certain kinds of effects. Does the brain state therefore count as belief? Well, I think it's just like saying, it's a sort of vague question, a bit like the ship of Theseus or something. You can say what you like, and there is no fact about it. And so then I tended to think the same. I'm inclined to think this. It's not something on which I've got a settled opinion at the moment, but I'm inclined to think the same about what are called religious beliefs. So that there are modes of behavior that are connected with religion. Those behaviors are caused by brain states that themselves have certain kinds of causes, often quite specific sorts of causes, to do with what you might call religious education or religious upbringing. They often don't penetrate into other areas of people's lives, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And they seem to be, in some cases, impervious to the sorts of evidence and argument by which we reckon that other things are beliefs. Does that mean that they shouldn't count as beliefs? Well, I think, again, it can be a matter of degree. So there are states of the brain that have, that probably should count as beliefs and that have typically religious effects. Other states of the brain, in people who call themselves religious, but in many respects, they don't have those effects. So I think they can be called religious states of mind, if you like, but whether they should count as beliefs, I think, is dubious, essentially for the reasons that I stated. So that's a rough statement of how I'm thinking about it at the moment.
Yeah, that's very interesting. On the sort of functionalist assumption, I wonder if that could be maybe relaxed a little bit. Maybe you could say that some mental state or state of the brain, if you prefer, satisfying those, for some mental state to count as a belief, it must satisfy, at least, it might be vague, but it must satisfy those criteria. But maybe that's not like sufficient. Maybe there's something more to being a belief that's not really functional. And maybe you could still generate the argument from that, even.
Yeah. What do you mean? You could generate my argument, or you could.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. So, I mean, you might. Yes, indeed. I mean, you're quite right that the way I was presenting it was that all of that was necessary for a belief and sufficient. But actually, you're right. All I need to say is that having those features, or connecting up, hooking up with action, hooking up with evidence in those ways, might be necessary for belief, but it may not be sufficient. And I don't even need to say that it's sufficient. You're right. All I can say is it's necessary, or it's one of the features that's relevant for settling whether someone's in a state of belief. But other things might be needed as well. And that would be further reason to doubt, indeed, whether people have these beliefs. And perhaps it might be the truth is, I mean, I sometimes even feel this about mental state concepts on Wittgenstein's view. The truth is just that, belief is just a useful abbreviation that we use. And the truth, God's big book of truths doesn't mention beliefs. It just mentions, brain states or something. And it's often a distortion, covering a very wide range of different kinds of very complicated ways in which brain states hook up with the external world, both as causes and as effects, to distinguish some of them of what we call beliefs. But really, that's just a convenient abbreviation for the truth. And the truth is much more complicated and in some ways less interesting.
Yeah. That's a view I'm very much sympathetic with, that a lot of our sort of mental categories and stuff like that are, I mean, they're useful, but in everyday life, in terms of explaining and predicting behavior and categorizing some of the states we find ourselves in, but it's not, well, the underlying phenomena is much more complex than perhaps these categorizations let on. And they have extremely vague boundaries, and it's not like we're sharply cutting nature at its joints or something with these categories.
Exactly. Quine has a passage somewhere where he says that the attribution of belief is essentially a dramatic idiom. It's not in the scientific language, it's a dramatic language. And what that means is that when I say, Jones believes that P, I'm, so to speak, simulating Jones. That's what I'm doing. I'm so to speak, doing, so as to give the hearer some idea in a way that I couldn't do more concisely than that, the range of behaviors or the range of attitudes that they can expect from Jones. That's the point of belief locution. It's not to report some objective state in Jones's mind. It's simply a way to convey a very wide and vague and perhaps open-ended range of behaviors on the part of Jones in a convenient but imprecise way. So just as you say, it doesn't cut nature at the joints. I mean, I've never been very happy with that phrase, but if that means, it doesn't describe anything real, then I think that I suspect that might be true.
Right. And I was thinking about some ways that people might want to push back against the conclusion you draw here. So just to throw some things out, someone might say that, okay, for many religious people, maybe they haven't really worked out some of the consequences of their religious beliefs, and so maybe they don't play as strong of a role as you might expect in guiding their actions and so forth. Or maybe they have worked out some of those consequences, but they don't play a stronger role either because they care more about other things, or they are irrationally ignoring the relevance of their religious beliefs. Or on the sensitivity to evidence, maybe they are sensitive to evidence, but their commitment is just so strong to these beliefs that it would take a lot of evidence to sway them, or they just aren't very reflective on the evidence that they receive. I mean, what do you think of these sorts of responses?
Yeah, good. I mean, I think one could indeed always introduce additional hypotheses about the people that you're talking about to say that actually, well, these are really beliefs that they've got rather than some other states. I suppose in some cases, I mean, certainly in the case of many sort of thoughtful and reasonable, and in many ways, basically secular religious people that I know, it seems somewhat implausible, when you point out to them, this is what you're really committed to, and they have a sort of basically scientific view of the world, and yet they're committed to all this stuff that seems to presuppose a non-scientific view of the world. You might think it's not as though the evidence seems to be they have worked out the consequences of what they believe, but they still fear death. They still fear their children's death. They still believe in medicine, for instance. They still act in many ways according to a sort of very secular and straightforward morality. And the direction of fit seems to be the other way around, that actually, they have basic moral views, which they then justify by finding the relevant bits of their religion that will support them and rejecting the bits of their religion that don't support them. I find that, when people talk about in Islam, for instance, that often happens. And that reflects better on the people than it does on the religion, I think. It sort of shows that actually, their commitment to the religion isn't really one of genuinely believing it, because otherwise they would behave in different ways. Now, you're right. Of course, one could always invent alternative hypotheses to explain it. So this is at best provisional. I suppose the point was just a model of what it would be to give an account of engagement in something which could be important in someone's life in ways that don't necessarily require calling it belief. And it might even be that that's always been the center of gravity of religion historically. And it was only Christianity, it was only the centrality of the creed and so on that actually artificially made Christianity, or Christianity as we nowadays think of it, as more about belief. Whereas, religion like Hinduism or Judaism may perhaps be not so much about belief, but more about rituals and practices and other forms of behavior that only have a tangential or partial overlap, tangential relation to or partial overlap with something worth calling belief. So you're right, it's an empirical question in every case. And I think the thing to say is just, given the conception of belief that I have, which is sort of, as I say, sort of Wittgensteinian stroke functionalist, it opens the possibility for there being a wide range of cases, of which religious belief is a very good example, where people don't have that beliefs. I should say, of course, that actually it does go against some of the first-person reports of many religious believers. So there are people who, explicitly say, they're quite clear what they mean by belief. And they say, yes, I do believe these things. So I'm quite willing to accept there are lots of people, religious people who genuinely do believe the claims that you're supposed to. I just think that a large range of such people, including many reasonable religious people, don't do something worth calling believing.
Right. I think that's pretty fair. I mean, you can say something, somewhat cautious, which is that at least for some religious belief people, and maybe a large number of them, but you're not necessarily decided on that because it's somewhat an empirical question. They don't have the features required for these sorts of religious beliefs. I mean, it's at least an open possibility, even if others do.
So. I think so. So it's something, I mean, that's something that I want to think further about and try to understand, in the sorts of religions that I engage with, the religious people that I engage with, the extent to which the states that they have really are worth calling beliefs or something else. And more generally, the role that, the role, perhaps the distorting role that ascriptions of states like beliefs, can play in our understanding of other minds.
Do you think, have you given much thought of what, aside from like distinctively religious belief, where else that this might be in effect? I mean, maybe certain political beliefs or something else, or have you given much thought to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't actually given much direct thought about that, but you're right. It's a very interesting question. When you think about, perhaps even very general beliefs like philosophical beliefs, you might think the extent to which people are really committed to them, whatever they say they believe, is an open question. And even if you think about scientific theory, for instance. So if you think about somebody like Van Frassen's way of thinking about science, so Van Frassen thought that the point of scientific inquiry wasn't to describe reality truly, it was just to describe reality in a way that predicts experiences. And so he thought that one doesn't believe scientific theories, one accepts them, where to accept a scientific theory means that you believe that it's empirically adequate. That is, you believe that it describes your experiences adequately, not that it's true. So even in the case of, so that's coming at it from a different direction. But even in that case, you might think, well, there are, people don't believe, the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics or the Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics, or people don't believe this or that, very, very abstruse theoretical part of science, set theory or something like that. But they do believe, or they do accept it, and they do believe that it plays a role in making the right predictions of experience. And that in turn is sort of connected to things like, if you think about, so the way Milton Friedman thought about positive economics, for instance, he thought it was a theoretical science. And what he meant by that was it isn't trying to describe reality. And he didn't believe that people were rational, utility maximizers, expected utility maximizers. All he thought was that for the purposes that he cared about, they behaved as if they were, at least some of the time. So I think that general approach to economics in the second case and to theoretical physics in the first case might be another illustration of the things that you're talking about. I mean, it's a good question. I haven't really thought through what other cases there might, or maybe philosophical beliefs, but what other cases might be where you could extend this model that I'm trying to work out. But that too might be an area where something like that is plausible and exciting.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to move on to a question. I know you're familiar with like fine-tuning arguments for theism, fine-tuning arguments for theism, and I wanted to get your take on a sort of response that seems plausible to me. So specifically for fine-tuning arguments that are like Bayesian in structure, the universe being fine-tuned for life is highly unlikely given atheism or naturalism, and not so unlikely given theism, and given some reasonable constraint on the priors, we should favor theism over atheism or naturalism or whatever the alternative hypothesis is. And my thought had to do with, well, if we're comparing atheism or naturalism more broadly as a relatively weak thesis, not saying a lot about the world, we're comparing that to the sort of designer hypothesis, which would be required to do the work in the argument, which is going to say a lot more, right? You have a certain being, a designer, and it is disposed to create a world with certain parameters, or at least a certain range of parameters. That's saying a lot about what the world is likely to be like. And that hypothesis, which says a lot more than the first, is therefore less likely a priori, right? We should have a much smaller prior on that hypothesis. And arguably, it's going to balance out, right? the hypothesis which says a lot more is going to be so much more less likely that the fine-tuning evidence doesn't favor it over the other. I mean, this is at least a rough sketch, but what do you think of this? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. So just let me repeat it back to you to make sure I've got clear about it. Okay, so you're saying that we've got two competing accounts. There's
right.
the sort of naturalistic account, and then there's this fine-tuning account. And the naturalistic account, let's suppose for the sake of argument, and I would dispute this, but let's suppose for the sake of argument that on the naturalistic account, it's pretty unlikely that the parameters were sort of suitable for life. The universe was fine-tuned for life. And on the theistic account, it's going to be pretty likely. But then you say, yeah, but hold on, the kind of theistic account that makes it really likely has itself got to be a very specific theistic account. It's got to say it isn't just some as Hume put it, some incompetent or shambolic or training God. It's got to be some pretty good smart God who's able to fix these parameters quite specifically and is willing to as well. So it's quite a specific hypothesis, and that would give a high probability to the proposition that the universe is fine-tuned for life. But now that, because it's so specific, its prior is really low. So that if you think of it as the prior ratio of probabilities of these two hypotheses multiplied by the Bayes factor is equal to the posterior ratio of probability of these two hypotheses. And the prior ratio of probability of these two hypotheses is actually much lower than you think, because the prior probability of, given a very broad and general naturalistic hypothesis, which you might think is reasonably likely, versus a very specific and narrow theistic hypothesis, which you might think is reasonably unlikely, you're gonna end up with still, it might confirm to some extent, but you're still going to end up with a much lower probability for the theistic than for the naturalistic hypothesis. Is that the line?
Yeah, that's basically the idea. So I was thinking as a vast oversimplification, right? Suppose that there's like 1,000 different ways the world might be, right? And half of those include a universe that's designed and the other half don't, right? Include a universe that isn't designed. Obviously, there's other ways the world might be, multiverses, no universes, whatever, but just for simplicity. And of those 500 that include a universe that's designed, say only 20 of those include a universe that's life permitting. And on the other side, on the ones that aren't designed, only 20 of those include a universe which is life permitting. Well, if we have the atheistic hypothesis that there's a universe which isn't designed, say, well, that's not going to predict very strongly that universe is going to be that the actual world is going to be one of those 20 which are designed. But what's our prior on that hypothesis? Well, it's half, right? Because 500 of the 1,000 are satisfy that. Yeah. And the other hypothesis we have is, we can make it very simple, which is says the universe is designed by something which only creates universes that are life permitting. Well, what's our prior on that? I guess that'd be 0.05 or something like that. And whatever it is,
20 out of 500, so that's 4%, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was doing 20 out of 1,000, I guess.
Oh, right. So it's not right. So the prior, not the prior given that it was designed, but just the prior.
Yeah, just the prior.
Right, 2%. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Right.
And well, once you factor in the Bayes factor, that's going to balance out, and you could kind of, this is obviously a vast oversimplification of how we might reason about it in the actual case, but to kind of illustrate what's going on there, and why the prior on the theistic hypothesis is probably much lower than we think.
Yeah.
Does that seem
good? Yeah, that seems reasonable. I guess somebody might push back and say, well, that presupposes a uniform prior over all the worlds.
Right.
And you might think that given that the world was designed, it's much more likely to have been designed to permit life than to have been designed not to permit life. Simply because that's a salient way in which you can design something, I guess, or something like that. So you could imagine someone holding a non-uniform prior over the 500 worlds. So the 500 worlds that are designed have a probability of 0.5 that one of them will be realized. But given that the actual world is one of the designed worlds, you might think that actually the probability that it's the one that's designed to permit life is not 2, 20, and 500. It could be much bigger. It could be that those 20 worlds get most of the credence that goes to those 500 worlds. Because you might think design, if something's designed, it's likely to be designed to permit life. Now, that of course requires prior assumptions about what kinds of things could be designers. So that does require appeal to additional premises. But maybe I don't know, maybe that's a way that theists might push back on that point. And then you wouldn't get this exact balancing out that you have in mind, yeah?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I had two thoughts on that. One, I mean, it just seems to me that some bare design hypothesis doesn't really offer anything to predict what sort of thing would be designed. I mean, it doesn't tell us anything about, I don't know, if we want to think about it in terms of intentions or at least dispositions of the designer, maybe it's disposed to create entirely other sorts of universes that aren't life permitting. Why kind of bias it toward those? And the second thing I was thinking, the example setup was arguably incredibly charitable, assigning a prior to each hypothesis of 0.5, the designer and non-designer hypothesis. But we might have a much higher prior credence in the non-design hypothesis. In which case, I mean, even just for simplicity concerns, maybe, I don't know, or for other evidence we have, although that's not strictly prior. And so even if there's some bias on the design hypothesis to life-permitting universes, it may still not balance out the relatively low prior on design hypothesis, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. So okay, so there's 2 points. The first point was you might push back and say, well, look, if it's designed, that doesn't make it especially likely that it was designed to suit life. And then the second thing is the prior that you gave to its being designed at all was super generous, and that actually that should be really low. So yeah, I think that's right. So I think, of course, it's going to have to be very low in order for you to get, well, for you to get the sort of balancing out that you'd want. You're going to have a low prior, because the probability of a universe being, the sort of undesigned universe or naturalistic universe permitting life, we're supposing for the sake of argument, I mean, I do doubt this, but let's suppose for the sake of argument, that's really low, right? That's the probability of such a universe permitting life is like 10 to the minus 20 or 10 to the minus 400 or whatever, however low you want. Whereas the probability of a universe permitting life, if it was designed by a life designing God, would be 1. And the probability of the universe being designed, if it was designed by some designer, as long as it was greater than 10 to the minus 20 or whatever, there would be some degree of confirmation. So it would increase the probability to some extent of the hypothesis that the universe was designed. But if your prior for that was low, as indeed it reasonably should be, then that's not going to help very much. So I do kind of agree. I think that's a reasonable thing to push back on. And I think that's a reasonable. I mean, I'd have to work out exactly how much what the balancing out were. And different sets of priors would give different results. So with the wrong kinds of priors, someone might respond in a different way. Just going back to the point about design and the extent to which something which is designed is likely to permit life. By design, do you just mean something like was produced by an intelligent person, or do you mean was produced by an intelligent person with some end in mind?
I think design probably implies the latter, but I wonder if the argument could be made with the former in mind, because all that's really required is that you have something. I don't even think it really has to be in mind. What they're relying on is that you have something disposed in some way to create life-permitting universes, even if only weakly disposed, because that's going to raise probability. But of course, that's not going to be enough for a theistic argument. So they're going to want to make the designer be intentional and probably have things in mind, but maybe they don't need that.
Yeah. So if he's intentional and has things in mind, you might think, well, it's a natural thing to have in mind is something that's like you, I guess. Maybe you might think that. So that was the kind of argument you might have, because you can't get, decisive arguments in this area, I guess, but you can say things that might nudge people's priors in a certain direction. You might say, well, look, that's the kind of thing you'd expect a designer to do. So that should give you a prior that, an intelligent designer will create a universe that's going to be fit for life, that's going to be life permitting, would actually be a bit higher than you thought. I think you can say things like that, but you're right. I mean, I don't know. It seems pretty weak, and it's not going to get you very far. So then I think that's it's a reasonable thing to say to them.
Yeah, although I think my approach can handle that kind of in stride, which would be to say, okay, I guess the designer hypothesis predicts more than we thought it did, maybe originally. It's going to rule out, or at least make less likely or more likely, certain spaces of the possibilities, and the fact that it does so makes it a stronger theory than we initially thought, and so the prior on it should be lower than we initially thought. Right. And arguably that might balance out, but whether it does is going to require some further reasoning. Although it kind of gets tricky, thinking about priors here, thinking about like uniform priors. Obviously, there's classic problems that face approaches to that, but as a broad kind of picture of a sort of response, I think is at least promising.
By the kinds of problems, do you mean sort of Bertrand's paradox type problems? So problems to do with principle of indifference and so on.
Right. Yeah. That's what I was thinking about. Because depending on how you carve up the space and so on, you can get different results that are inconsistent. Yeah. But you were saying a couple of times, you mentioned sort of in passing that you were had in mind maybe a different response to fine-tuning arguments, that you were kind of skeptical that the likelihood that the universe would be light permitting is low.
I mean, actually, I guess it was in part, in some ways, it's sort of complementary to your I mean, it's consistent with everything you're saying, and it's just complementary to some of your points. But it was just, I guess, my problem with the fine-tuning has always been, well, from a probabilistic perspective, has always been that there's no argument that's been given for thinking that the probability of a life-permitting universe on the naturalistic hypothesis is low, unless you simply assume a uniform distribution, a uniform prior over the range of parameters on a certain way of measuring that range of parameters. So if you have, for instance, a uniform prior over the possible values of the ratio of mass of, I don't know, a neutron to an electron or whatever it is, as measured, maybe you'll get one result. Maybe if you have uniform set of priors over the square of that ratio, you might get different results, or some other way of measuring it. So depending on how you measure the thing, you might get different priors. Even if it's uniform in one way, it might not be uniform in another way. But even setting that aside, no justification has been given for uniformity there. Because after all, what are our only grounds for assigning probability to any event, I would say, is observation of the frequency with which events of that type occur. And if that is our only grounds, we've only got one, one universe. And I mean, I don't know, I'm not enough of a physicist to be able to tell you that we haven't got lots of simulations of universes that we can measure, but as far as I know, we don't. And so as far as I know, we may have, very little reason to think, or very little pushing us towards giving a uniform prior. For all we've only seen one universe, that universe does permit life. So why think the probability of an undesigned universe permitting life has got to be low? That seems unwarranted, quite unwarranted to me.
Yeah, that seems fair to me. I mean, maybe someone might say something like, well, maybe this is not something someone might say, but this is another sort of issue. How are we construing the space of possibilities? Is it all the possibilities, like physical universes that share the parameters that the actual universe has, but different value? Is it some metaphysical or logical space of possibilities? if it's something like that, like, oh, okay, how likely is it that, given the background is logically possible universes or whatever, or worlds, that given that the universe at that world is undesigned, that it would be life permitting? Plausibly, that's low, but I mean, yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my own way of thinking about it was kind of to hold fixed some subset of the laws and just vary the values of the parameters describing fundamental constants. But you're right, think of a much broader range of possible worlds. Of course, those will include worlds where it's a law of nature, for instance, that as soon as something appears, life appears, let's say. Or it's a law of nature that it takes much less to make the universe life permitting, or that, so it will be hard to make a case that in that much broader space of worlds, there's a plausible measure which gives high probability to the ones where, the naturalistic ones where life doesn't appear, as opposed to the naturalistic ones where it doesn't. Because naturalistic now includes worlds where the laws of nature so it can be so different that they permit life under any circumstances, let's say. And if there's uncountably many of those, and there's uncountably many worlds where it does, why should we give a higher measure to one than to the other?
Yeah, it is kind of difficult. I think that's a good point. I suppose my response is even to just grant that the unlikelihood on that somewhat weak theory, and say that the argument still doesn't go through plausibly. But I think that's also a good response. Yeah.
You mean it doesn't? Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. I mean, I think nothing I said is really in tension with your own comments, and they could be complementary. I mean, the thing is, it might not be surprising if there's more than one thing wrong with the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah, that's that's fair. Yeah, no, I think there are other things. So I did want to let's see, some questions on more decision theory type stuff. I did a kind of general question about decision theory, and I think it's something you're probably sensitive to. So decision theories and like standard decision problems are really typically highly idealized. And so like credences and preferences are taken to be precise and well-defined, but in reality, that's not the case usually, right? They're often somewhat vague and maybe even quite vague. Plausibly, we want a decision theory that can take as inputs those sorts of attitudes that people in fact have. Do you think the standard evidential decision theory or causal decision theory or something else is sufficient, or would we need to add something to generalize it to those cases? What do you think?
Yeah. The theory, so evidential decision theory, and I think the same thing goes for causal decision theory, as standardly developed. So the formalism as it's standardly developed clearly isn't applicable directly in that way. So just to give an example, if you think about the foundations of evidential decision theory, it involves making, the Volcker-Jeffrey theorem, involves making all kinds of assumptions about the structural preferences, which are totally unrealistic. If you think about these assumptions of continuity and so on, it requires a very large range of objects of choice, and it requires all kinds of constraints on your preferences amongst them, which probably no real person actually has. So in one sense, it's merely an ideal theoretical construction. Having said that, it can still be useful in various ways. So one of the ways it can be useful is that it can show us what a certain ideal of rationality from a certain perspective can look like, and can raise issues that are of interest, might be of interest to anyone, even if you're not going to be ideally rational. You just can't be in that on that definition. But more than that, I think it's usually reasonably easy to see how the results of that sort of highly refined version of the theory map over to actual practical cases, because in many of the results that matter are kind of qualitatively robust, by which I mean those results survive even if you relax many of the assumptions. And that was something that I did a little bit of in my recent book. I sort of tried to show that although decision theory is usually represented as involving precise numerical assumptions, you can actually get many of the basic verdicts of evidential decision theory, let's say, and no doubt to a causal decision theory by making much more relaxed assumptions. And the thing is more messy and it's more difficult, but you can still do it. So if you think about cases where people are actually making decisions on which evidential decision theory, let's say, might differ from causal decision theory. So cases where, any case where there's some non-causal, there's some correlation between what you do and some state of the world, which isn't caused by what you do. That can happen. And it's clear enough what the device is that evidential decision theory gives there. And you don't need to rely on the heavy apparatus of the formal theory. Formal theory is interesting from a variety of perspectives. If you want to understand from the Ramsey type perspective, understanding what belief is, understanding what credence is, and so on. And similarly in Savage, understanding subjective probabilities. So there is, philosophy of mind and, mathematical interest, technical interest in those things. But in terms of its practical applicability, I think you can make sense of it and see how it applies in real cases reasonably often, because although we don't in fact satisfy the axioms of evidential decision theory, we don't have to in order for much of it to be still applicable.
Yeah, that's good. That's kind of what I would expect. But do you think that still it would be useful to have to expand the theory to deal with those cases? Like, yeah, it's fine that we don't in fact have to have the precise credences and preferences, and we can use that to sort of model and make recommendations on our actions. But maybe to tell us more or give more informative answers, we should, or at least could want to expand the utility calculus.
Yeah, sorry, do you mean it might be a good idea to develop the more precise theory? Is that what you mean? Yeah, of course it can be. And of course, with computers and so on, with machines, we can have much more sophistication, and we can, no doubt, there'll be a time when either people or the inventions of people come closer to meeting some of these desiderata. And therefore, there could be a time when the actual theory itself is much more readily applicable than we now think. And in any case, we can think of it as a kind of ideal of rationality. So we can say, if you're not meeting these, then something's gone wrong in you're irrational in some respect. You might think of it as that, as a sort of model of rationality. I think that's probably a bit too demanding, but you could understand it in that way too. So there are going to be cases where it's useful and where it's interesting. And of course, the other thing is that by developing a precise theory, you can sort of give sharp focus to some of these debates, so that in modern debates between evidential decision theory, causal decision theory, the whole thing can be conducted with some sort of numerical precision. And that means that certain kinds of intuitions and certain kinds of distortions introduced by intuitions and so on, well, it's kind of intuitive that evidentialism says this, or it's intuitive that causalism says this. Those sources of error are eliminated because we can actually prove, well, this is what the evidential theory recommends, this is what the causal theory recommends, and it might be surprising. So that's one reason I think why the sort of increased rigor of the theory can be useful, when you think about the philosophical applications.
Right, fair enough. And pinpointing those disagreements in a much more complicated theory is, well, going to be much more difficult. Yeah. Makes sense. And another thing, Richard Pettigrew has published a book last year called Choosing for Changing Selves, and you wrote a review on that. And that explores the complicated issue of making choices that will have impact on our future selves, and which we anticipate will or at least might vary in preferences, beliefs, and circumstances, and so forth. And I think he has some view on what you should form your decision based on some weighted sum of past, present, and future utilities.
That's right.
What do you think broadly of that approach and of this issue in general?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I should say is I thought it was a terrific book. I learned a lot from it. I thought it's an interesting question, and it's dealt with his sort of characteristic rigor and thoroughness, and so it was just superb. So generally, it was excellent, and I really enjoyed reading it. I was very glad I had the chance to review it. In terms of my view of the overall project, there was one respect in which I did have some questions, which were to do with how you think about the overall project of getting some kind of weighted sum of your past, present, and future desires, and using that to choose what to do, rather than thinking you've got your present desires, which include within them weights given to your future selves, and perhaps also weights given to your past selves, and what those should be. And it's the difference between a model where you think of a vote, what you do is decided by a vote in which you and your past and future selves are all voters. That's one question, which Richard is answering, how that vote should be conducted. But you might think there's another question, which is that's not how decisions work, or that's not how they should work. How decisions work isn't a vote in which your past, present, and future selves all get a vote. What it is that your past, present, and future selves are all weighted to some extent by your present self. Your present self takes them into account, and then your present self makes a decision. So it's a difference between, the sort of model of democracy, the representative model of democracy, and the sort of delegate model of democracy. So if Burke has this speech he was the MP for Bristol, and the speech to the constituents of Bristol, where he says, you don't elect MPs to Parliament to reflect your views. You elect MPs to Parliament as the people you think are going to make good decisions on behalf of you. That's how it works. And kind of that's how I sort of think of making decisions for your future self, and the extent to which you take your past, present, and future. And that might mean taking no account of your future desires, or it might mean taking some account of your future desires. But they don't, so to speak, that already is factored into your present desires. It's not as though your future and past desires independently enter into what you want to do together with and separately from your present desires. They have to be factored into your present valuations. That's kind of how I think about it. So, and that made a difference, as I recall, the way that Rich's approach worked. And so for that reason, I had some doubts about that aspect of the project, which I tried to spell out in the towards the end of that review, as I recall. But that, as I say, that shouldn't take away from the fact that I thought it was fascinating. And even if you had those concerns, there's still so much that you could learn from the book. So I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, very, very, very good. That seems right to me. Like, your future self isn't literally going to be like part of the decision you make now. It's maybe what you expect to be like or prefer and so forth at some future time. But that's all going to factor into your current, beliefs and desires, right?
Exactly.
That's going to be relevant to your present decision. So I don't see how that's any different than just like standard utility calculus.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's not going to be some sort of weighted sum. It's not going to be like a democratic vote where it's a weighted sum that gets everybody's independent factors, gets your past, present, and future selves. But as I recall, his formula seemed to make it, it depended on its working like that. So that was kind of what my concern was, I guess.
Yeah. Now, of course, this could still bring attention, and rightfully bring attention to the importance of, reflecting on what you're likely to be like in the future and what impact that can have on, what relevance that can have to the choices you make now and so forth. But I don't think that's like fundamentally different than just standard decision theory reasoning, right?
No, I thought no, exactly. And standard decision theory reasoning places relatively few rational constraints on how you weight those things, right? So you weight, you might weight your future selves less and less as you go further into the future. You might weight them all equally or something like that. And there may be some, for instance, hyperbolic discount rates that have some, that are rationally criticizable. But there's a very large range. You don't have to give them all equal weights, for instance. There's a very large range of different weights that you can give that would still be, perfectly rational as far as standard decision theory goes through.
Right.
I think so. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I believe you have a forthcoming book, or at least it's in on the value of the future. Do you discuss related issues there, or at least do you mind discussing briefly on plans for that book?
Yeah. So basically, the book covers some of those issues. It's about discounting and discounting for the future. So the fact that you care more about the near future than about the distant future, and whether that's rational, whether it's rationally criticizable, whether it's a problem. Okay. So one thing that people often say is that it's just a mistake to, care much more about your present than your distant future. And this comes out in all kinds of behavior. So you prefer to have one apple now than 2 apples in a week's time, let's say, or you prefer to eat sweets now and not go and exercise, even though in the long term that'll make you worse off. Or you prefer to consume now to consuming later. Or you put off filling in you just put off doing your tax return, not because it's going to make it any easier to do it. In fact, it might make it even harder to do it, but simply because you'd rather do it later than do it now. So these are all cases where we prioritize the present over the future. If you like, in Pettigrew type terms, we weight our future selves less than we weight our present selves. And people often act as though there's something irrational about that. I don't think it's irrational. That in itself isn't irrational. I mean, one very natural, popular reason for thinking it's irrational is because you're the one who suffers the consequences of your own, your own silly choice. But part of the burden of the first part of the book is simply to defend the idea that the whole idea of a unified self that persists across all of those times is kind of arbitrary and conventional, and it's something of a fiction. So you think you are the person that you have a special concern about in the future. But what makes that person you rather than somebody else? Well, the only thing is there's certain kind of psychological connections that you have to that person. Those are connections that you might have to someone else. Those connections are contingent, and there's no special reason why you should care about those rather than anyone else. In fact, the reason, the explanation why we have special concern for that future person, I assume, is evolutionary, that's the person who has our genes. So just as there's a sort of explanation for why, this is rather crude Hamilton's rules have explanation for why you care about members of your family is that they have strong overlap, genetic overlap with you. So there is a person in the future who has really strong genetic overlap with you. And that's the person that you care about the most because there's an evolutionary reason why you should care about it. Or rather, that's the explanation. It doesn't justify it, but that's the explanation. Okay. So that's why you think you might care about that person, but it doesn't make it rational to care as much about that person in the distant future as it is to care about present you. And so that argument doesn't work. Other arguments are sometimes given, for instance, that you will regret what you do. But again, I think that's a poor argument. There are arguments from Aristotle. In fact, the only philosopher who seems to think that it's, it can rationally make a difference how far away in time something is, to how you value it, is Bentham. And he mentions it briefly. But everyone else, Rawls, Aristotle, Parfit, all of them give various arguments for thinking that there's something irrational about that. So I say something about why that's wrong. Having said all that, there is a kind of discounting of the future that I think is arguably irrational, and that's what's called hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting means not that you don't value the future less than the present, it means you do value the future less than the present, but also that the rate at which you disvalue it isn't constant. So it isn't that each day is 10% less valuable to you or 20% less valuable to you. And we can see that actually human beings typically do discount the future hyperbolically if we think about simple thought experiments. So for instance, it might be true if I ask you, would you rather have, two sweets today or 1 sweet tomorrow? You might say, well, I'd rather have 2 sweets today. If I then ask you, would you rather have 2 sweets in 100 days time or 1 sweet in 2 sweets in 101 days time or 1 sweet in 100 days time? You'd probably say, well, I'd rather have the 2 sweets in 101 days time. So just to repeat that, you would say you would rather have 1 sweet today than 2 sweets tomorrow because you prefer the present, but you would rather have 2 sweets in 100 days time, 2 sweets in 101 days time to 1 sweet in 100 days. So the delay of a day is worth that much to you when it's now, but that same temporal delay matters much less to you when it's further in the future. That's actually inconsistent. Most human beings do have those preference patterns, and they're actually inconsistent. It means that when you get to 100 days from now, you end up doing something that when you get to 100 days from now, you'll take the 1 sweet now rather than the 2 sweets tomorrow, even though right now you would rather be doing something else. So you end up with an inconsistent pattern of preferences. And this is what explains why people do things that, people often do things that are irrational. Addiction is an example of this. The thing about addiction is that, you now don't want to have a drink in 10 days time, but 10 days from now, you're going to want to have that drink. Or, you buy a gym membership, but you never use it. The reason gyms make money is because they charge people up front. They take on the membership because they want to use it in 10 days time, or in a week's time. But when they get to that point, they don't want to use it. So the gym sort of gets the money from the membership, but it doesn't lose the money from the sort of depreciation from people using the products. So those are all examples of the kind of discounting. There's one specific kind of discounting that's irrational. And then the last bit of the book is about how we can address that. And there I sort of appeal. There's a nice argument from Hume, which sort of says, he didn't have the mathematics for it, but it says, roughly speaking, what I advocate, which is that the best ways to address this are sort of self-commitment devices. So that things like you would now pay a little bit of money for the liquor store to stop you from visiting it in 10 days time. So liquor stores should offer, things like that. And, some gambling websites do offer it, but the gambling website should offer it in a certain way to be delayed. So they should say, fine, if you pay us $1 now, we'll stop you from using our website, and we'll put a limit to how much you can bet when you go on our site in a week's time. And those methods utilize hyperbolic discounting. So the very weakness that we have can also be the cure of that weakness. And the reason that's attractive to me is because it's not paternalistic. It's kind of quite it's compatible with my sort of classical liberal principles, which is that nobody's being forced not to gamble, or nobody's being forced not to drink, but the individual themselves makes a choice over whether to drink or to gamble. So that's, sorry, I went on for ages, but that's basically the sort of idea of what I wanted to drone on about in that book.
Yeah, that's great. I'll have to, I'll definitely want to check that out. Part of what you said there did make me think of something that came up with John Martin Fisher on immortality and extended life. So a lot of people might say, well, I prefer to live some number of years. Say they don't want to live forever. But they might prefer, and they might even predict that they would prefer, as that time approaches, that they would prefer to live longer.
Yeah.
Right. So suppose I say, I prefer to live 100 years. Okay, but once you get to around 100, you're going to start to want to prefer to live longer, and you can even predict that you would. Exactly. Is that the sort of inconsistent preferences?
Yeah. So that's exactly it. So it's as time goes on, your preferences change in a way that make them incompatible. If your discounting was exponential, or if it was constant, then you wouldn't get that phenomenon arising, or at least the mere discount curve itself wouldn't create that problem. But you're right. So that's a phenomenon of human beings which causes them to end up being inconsistent. Because what you would do is you say, fine, I'll only pay for the 100-year life now, but when you get to 99 years, you'll end up paying for extra, and going for the extra lifespan, and so doing something that your past self wouldn't have wanted you to do. And that can lead to sort of, sure losses, whether it would, it could even, I guess, in principle in that case. But it's definitely an example of what I had in mind. Yeah.
Right. Very good. So I did want to ask a couple of questions related to a couple other papers in the literature. So Adam Elga has a paper, I think, forthcoming called Confession of a Causal Decision Theorist, if you're familiar. And so building on some of your work, he argues that the following three are collectively inconsistent. Endorsing betting on the laws past in the way your evidence seems to support in the hypothetical, endorsing two boxing and Newcomb's problem, and endorsing a suppositional decision theory, and where, roughly speaking, a suppositional theory is one which calculates utility in part using a probability function, which is calculated supposing certain actions, either by conditionalization, subjunctive supposition, or something else. So I found the conclusion interesting that he says, and I'll just read it. He says, there are viable ways to reject each of bet, two-box, and suppositional. Each way faces its own challenges, and I won't try to choose between them here. But as a causal decision theorist, I must confess the independent appeal of each premise makes me wish I didn't have to choose. course, I think I know what you would choose, but how serious of an issue do you think this is for the causalist or someone with causalist intuitions?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's a serious issue. Part of it's going to depend on your intuitions, I suppose, about the betting on the laws case. So that, for instance, you might say about the betting on the laws case that actually it's fine. It's fine to bet on the thing that is not a law, that it is a law. I have to say, many causal decision theorists I've spoken to don't really want to go that way. So they sort of say, well, there's something wrong with the causal decision theory that predicts that, and actually you've misunderstood what causal decision theory can be. So another option, I suppose, would be to reject the two-box intuition. Now, can causal decision theory do that? Well, there are sort of supposed to be some kind of deterministic versions of causal decision, deterministic compatible or compatibilism compatible versions of causal decision theory that can accept going for the one-box solution in certain versions of Newcomb's problem, such as the one that I think Adam combines with the betting on the laws case. Because as I recall from that paper, it's a while since I've seen it, but as I recall from that paper, it's got to be quite a specific version of betting on the past. It's got to be like a betting on the past case. That's the specific type of Newcomb problem where you need to, where the two-boxing intuition has got to go in order to relieve the pressure. And you could presumably or possibly reject the two-boxing intuition in that case, still call yourself some kind of suppositional or even causal decision theorist, and accept the two-boxing in other sorts of Newcomb cases. The problem with that would be trying to find a principled way of ruling out two-boxing in that specific version of the Newcomb problem. That is the case where the dependency hypotheses are about states of the world that predetermine you to act in a certain way. So if you can do that, then I guess that's a possibility of causal decision theory. Obviously, from my perspective, it's not a problem at all because I know what I do. But I think Adam has put his finger on in a very clear and straightforward way on what looks like a seriously difficult choice for the causal decision theorist.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to recall there are some people who have tried to defend one boxing on some causalist theory. I think I recall a paper from some time ago by Wolfgang Spahn who tries to argue something like that. There's probably others that are slipping my mind right now, but
yeah. I think Sanger and Williamson have something like that view in a
right.
paper where they sort of rule out, causal dependency hypotheses that are not worth considering for some reason. And I think they've got some sort of nomological criterion for when they're not worth considering. And that gives you, that it seems is going to give you one boxing in the betting on the past case.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that paper up next. It was Alex Sandgren and Timothy Williamson. Yeah. And
because they're going to say, aren't they? I mean, I can't remember, but I would have thought they will say in the betting on the past, you would one box.
Yeah. So the paper is called Determinism, Counterfactuals, and Decision. I think it might be forthcoming, but so what they try to do is maintain the causalist intuitions, like for the most part. But as you say, they want to rule out certain outcomes from consideration that would violate laws. So prior to assessing certain counterfactuals and determining utility. So actually, I'm going to just quote part of it. They say, Ahmed is right that unadorned CDT regards certainly non-actual worlds as open to free agents, but SDT, which is what they're going to call some sort of selective decision theory. I forget what the term is exactly they use for it. Makes no such requirement. This is the crux of our disagreement with Ahmed. He regards the kind of counterfactual just described as definitive of causalism. We think that a more nuanced position is required. Counterfactual thinking is definitive of causalism at the level of expected utility calculations. The core of causalism is that expected utility is a matter of expected causal efficacy, but before calculating expected utility, the causalist is entitled to use non-counterfactual reasoning to restrict the set of outcomes that go into the expected utility calculation. the actual world matters, even for the causalist. Proponents of SDT care about causation, although they deny that all outcomes are worth causally promoting. And specifically, not quoting here, the ones that would involve law violations. So do you have any thoughts on this approach? I mean, is it an improvement to standard CDT, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing I would say is that I imagine it gives pretty much the same verdicts as standard CDT in most cases. So there's going to be some cases where I still think it might run into trouble. So if you think about, so I have cases like, I think maybe, I don't know if they discussed my Death in Damascus case, or my version of the dicing with death case, for instance. But just on what they say there, it's true that I always thought about causal decision theory as something which evaluates options by comparing their performances at worlds that are causally accessible to you, across worlds that are causally accessible to you, where those are worlds which match the actual world in features that you can't causally affect. But other than that, they simply vary in accordance with your choices given that match. And that's going to include worlds that violate the actual laws. So now, if they want to rule out worlds that violate those laws, so that the input for selection by CDT is sort of restricted, I guess my question would be, is there some principled way of doing that? What's the rationale for doing it, or is it just going to be an arbitrary restriction? Because I'm sure it's true that if you made an arbitrary restriction on what worlds causal decision theory can compare or think about, then you might be able to get the right results coming out. But there has to be some principle. And the principle has to be one which stops the theory from just collapsing into EDT, something equivalent to something non-causal. So then the question is, what's the principle of selection? How is it, on what basis is it that you can rule out some worlds as ones worthy of consideration by CDT, and then simply choose the one that CDT ranks highest amongst the rest, the action that CDT ranks highest when you consider their impact only amongst the rest of the worlds? And I wasn't sure I could identify a plausible principle of that sort. I guess that's what concerned me. Well, that's what my current feeling is about that view. I mean, I should say I can see why it's an improvement, and I can see why they do it, and I can, it's well argued. But I guess my own doubts arise from that. So, what is the principle? I mean, do you remember what it is they say? What the principle is on the basis of which they rule out these worlds? Is it just that they're certainly not actual, or is it something stronger than that?
Well, it's sort of that, but they actually leave it a bit open. So I was going to follow up because this relates to an issue that they seem to recognize and discuss a few different options, but say that they don't really have a good answer for it, right? So that issue is this: are we just saying that if it's if we assign like probability 1, right, to the fact that this is a law of nature or something like that, is that the only case where would like rule it out in the procedure here? Or if we're like merely highly confident that it's a law of nature or that it's the case, would we rule that out?
Yep.
Is there some threshold that seems it's going to be kind of arbitrary unless, or does it vary gradually? It might just collapse us back into evidential decision theory. And I don't think, well, one, they don't seem to give a clear answer on that. They seem to leave it open. And two, on your question, they don't seem to really have a reason for having this sort of principle in the first place, except that I guess it fits an intuition that in this case, it would be the standard causal decision theory seems to get it wrong, but I don't think there's much more than
Yeah, good. I mean, you could just say, fine, we're just going to fiddle with causal decision theory. Yeah, because just making it 1 is going to seem arbitrary. Having a cutoff point is going to seem arbitrary. Just saying, well, we're just going to do it in such a way that causal decision theory gives us the right results in this case. It's not so clear to me. It kind of depends. I guess it depends on what you think about the probabilistic versions of betting on the past. So there are versions of betting on the past that I don't think they discuss, where you don't have determinism, but you do have some kind of chancy process by which, for instance, the dependency hypotheses are hypotheses on which, one of them gives a chance of 99% if you're betting on it or against it, and the other one gives a chance of 1% if you're betting against it, for instance. So those are ones where it seems to me that the intuitions are just as close to one boxing as in the case where they're certain, chances 100%. But then are they going to say the same about those? And if you use for 99 to 98% and so on, and there, I'd have thought a gradualism is by far the overwhelmingly the more natural way to do it. It's not that you rule these things out, or that you have some threshold for ruling out, but rather they get a weight which is proportional to your confidence that they're going to be realized. But then you seem to be ending up quite close to the evidential theory. So it's kind of hard to see how you can avoid that collapse without having an arbitrary view. Now, I say, okay, there's an arbitrary view, and that might end up giving the right results in this case. Of course, I do think there are going to be other cases where causal decision theory makes mistakes in any case. I mean, quite aside from the arbitrariness of it. Because the thing about causal decision theory that made it plausible was meant to be that it was a motivated response to a certain type of question. It wasn't just, here we've got this causal intuition, we're just going to save it in these cases, but we'll add these things to it to solve these problems. The idea was, look, Jeffrey's theory gets it wrong in these Newcomb type cases. We've got to have a theory which gets it right. Here's our causal theory that gets it right, and it appeals to the intuition that you should care about what you can affect. That's what we should care about, what we can affect. So it seems to me that they're introducing an extraneous element, and that extraneous element is not clear how you could control it in a way that stops the thing from just collapsing to the evidential theory. Now I think I'm just repeating what you said, but that seems right to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an interesting paper and a interesting discussion.
No, it's an excellent paper.
Right. It would be nice to see some more expansion on that idea, maybe working out some of these difficult issues.
And I should say, there's no reason in principle why you couldn't work them out. There might be some more to say that we haven't thought about, and there could be a sort of, very natural way of accounting for it that just hasn't occurred to me. So it's perfectly possible that there could be a way around this. Of course, none of that affects Adam's point, because Adam's trilemma is still there. It's just they've chosen one way out of it.
Right. So I did want to, let's see. Yeah, so I did want to get your thoughts on a kind of simple argument in favor of two-boxing that a friend of mine has given. I have my own response, but I want to see what you think about it. The idea is pretty simple, right? So either there is $1 million in there or there's nothing. On the assumption that there's $1 million, you do better by two-boxing. On the assumption that there's nothing, you do better by two-boxing. Well, if you do better in either case, you should two-box. I mean, that's it's sort of a dominance argument, but how do you think about that?
I suppose part of it turns on what's meant by you do better by two-boxing. So on the assumption that there's $1 million, it's true that you would get more if you were to take both boxes than if you were to take just one, where these are subjunctive conditionals. On the other hand, conditional on taking two boxes, you do worse. Conditional on taking two boxes, you do worse than conditional on taking one box. So if you do take two boxes, you'll do worse. If you were to take two boxes, you do better. So it's not quite true that on the assumption. So now if you're saying, let's hold it fixed, let's hold it certain that there's $1 million in the opaque box. On that assumption, it's perfectly true that conditional on that assumption and taking two boxes, you do worse than you do better than conditional on that assumption and taking one box. That's true. And holding fixed the assumption that there's nothing in the opaque box, conditional on that assumption and taking both boxes, you do better than than what you do conditional on that assumption and that you take one box. That's true as well. But of course, that makes it a version of Simpson's paradox. Because now, of course, those conditional probabilities are true, but it simply doesn't follow from those things, just as it doesn't follow in Simpson's paradox case that just because boys do better at getting into maths and boys do better at getting into English, and those are the only two departments, it simply doesn't follow that boys do better than girls at getting into the university, or boys do better than non-boys in getting into the university. That way of reading it, I think the dominance argument fails, for the same reason as Simpson's paradox arises. The subjunctive way of reading it, the dominance argument works, but that kind of begs the question against the evidential theory, because the evidentialist is going to say, well, why care about the subjunctives? Who cares about that?
Yeah, that's Simpson's paradox was something that I mentioned. It seems right. it seems to me like this, if we analyze the conditional in this way, right? Well, what's really being implied is the following sort of conditional. If there is nothing in the box, then I do better by taking both boxes than I do by taking one box when there's nothing in the box. You have to specify that you're holding fixed that there's nothing in the box in the consequent of the conditional.
That's right.
But then it's not clear that the conclusion is going to follow, except by begging the question, why would we care about those conditionals when, because I would want to say the following sort of thing. If there's nothing in the box, it's not the case that I do better by by taking both boxes than by taking one, where we're not holding fixed in the consequent what's in the box. Because here, because if we want to say subjunctively or counterfactually, had I taken both boxes, the antecedent of this conditional would have been false. There wouldn't, actually, if I'd taken one rather than both, then the antecedent would be false. Most likely, there would have been $1 million in the box and I would have received more. If that makes sense. Sorry, that was a bit poorly stated. But
I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. It's just like, there are two methods for treating kidney stones. There's an invasive method and a non-invasive method. And if you look at the treatment for large kidney stones, the invasive method does better. And you look at the treatment for small kidney stones, the invasive method does better. That means if you hold fixed whether the kidney stones are large, the invasive method is better at removing them than the non-invasive, this ultrasound method. And if you hold fixed that the kidney stones are small, invasive surgery is better for removing them than non-invasive ultrasound. And yet overall, the overall success rate of invasive methods is lower than the overall success rate of non-invasive methods. So holding fixed that parameter, one method does better, however you hold it fixed. But once you don't hold it fixed, as you say, just you don't hold fixed what's in the opaque box, the other method is better. And so just as you say, holding fixed what's in the opaque box, two boxing does better. Holding fixed holding fixed there's $1 million in the opaque box, two boxing does better. Holding fixed there's nothing in the opaque box, two boxing does better. But it doesn't follow that two boxing does better.
Right.
So it's the sort of it feels as though you've got a dominance argument which is really plausible, but actually it's one of those cases where dominance arguments fail.
Right. So the problem there was that inference from, well, if it does better in both of these cases, so specified, it does better simplicator.
Possible cases. Yeah.
Right.
It's a bit like it's structurally the same, I think, as what's called the lazy argument. So the fatalist argument. You're gonna
yes.
Yeah. There's a Dummett's version was that there's an air raid. It was apparently popular during the Second World War. There's an air raid coming. If I'm going to die, then running to the bomb shelter is superfluous. Right. Sorry, it's useless. If I'm not going to die, running to the bomb shelter is superfluous. So I might as well not run to the bomb shelter. That's the argument. But of course, it simply doesn't follow from the fact that on the assumption you're going to die, you're better off not running to the bomb shelter. On the assumption you're not going to die, you're better off not doing it. Doesn't follow that you're better off not doing it. Same structure of the argument.
Yeah, I think, and then like some of those, there's like medical ones too, and how that was shown to, wasn't Savage's decision theory giving the wrong results on those, and that led to Jeffrey's. That's right. Because exactly. Because Jeffrey's theory is conditional. It takes account of the cases where the states are probabilistically related to what you do. Because exactly as you say, Savage's theory will give wrong results of those if it accepts a totally unrestricted application of dominance, which it appears to do. Fair enough. So I did want to talk about some work done by Liz Jackson on Pascal's wager. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but she kind of makes so it's interesting. She does make a decision theoretic sort of argument in favor of belief of God or cultivating belief in God. And the basic idea is this: we infinitely prefer, if you like, or have some infinite value of the heaven afterlife or the positive afterlife promised by many of the major religions. Christianity specifically, but that's not essential here. And well, in any plausible decision theory, when you calculate the expected utility of cultivating belief in God, since that predicts at least somewhat that you would, even if it's very unlikely, that you would receive this infinite utility, the expected utility is still infinite, right? Even if it's very unlikely, you might think that the story is true, even if it's a small chance by infinite utility is going to be infinite expected utility. And she has some way of defending against certain objections. Well, maybe other actions also have infinite utility. How you decide between them? Maybe there's some chance of a negative infinite utility, or however you think about that. But broadly, I mean, what do you make of this? And what do you make of using infinite utilities in decision problems?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple of things. The first thing is I guess my feeling about Pascal's wager has always been more or less the objection that you sketched, I think, which was that maybe there's some non-zero probability confidence that you have that God exists and would give infinite utility to believers. But I also have non-zero probability that anti-God exists, and gives infinite utility to non-believers. So there's no choice between those that Pascal's wager helps me decide. With regards to infinite utilities in decision theory, of course, you can have unbounded utilities in decision theory, but that doesn't mean infinite utilities. And I find it harder to make sense of those. And of course, I guess infinite utilities could, in a sense, be used to sort of model some kind of lexicographic ordering or something like that. So there's something that you just care about massively more than anything else, and however much you get of that other thing, you always care more about this thing, and that's a pattern of preferences which I guess is possible. And there's nothing. So the underlying preferences, which could be represented by infinite utilities, that is logically possible, isn't it? Because it's logically possible there's something I care about more than I care about any aggregate of any other things. And however much of anything else I get, and whatever else I get, I care more about that. So why not model that as an infinite utility? So in principle, that doesn't, that's plausible. But then, the difficulty with that is that, then you can't enter it into a standard probability calculus, standard sort of expected utility maximization calculus. So that part of the argument doesn't then make sense. So obviously infinite utilities is one of the things that I can't make sense of. And the other thing I can't make sense of is the sort of standard, how they get around. Maybe there are ways that I don't know about of getting around these sort of more or less standard objections to Pascal's wager. But what was the innovation in this paper? What was she doing that was new in her?
Yeah, so one thing in favor of, she offers some ways to potentially handle that sort of case where, well, there seem to be multiple options here that have infinite expected utility, including those that don't involve cultivating that belief, or may in fact include those that work against cultivating that belief. She wants to say that in those cases, we're going to sort of amend decision theory so as when we have different outcomes or different actions that have infinite expected utility, we take the one that's more likely to produce infinite expected utility, if that makes sense. Sorry. Well, both of them have infinite expected utility, but take the one that's more likely to produce the outcome, which has the infinite value. So, for example, if you're comparing the God versus anti-God case, well, okay, believing in God, if God exists and you believe in him, then you'll have infinite expected utility of doing so. And if anti-God exists, well, the infinite expected utility of not believing in God. But it's more likely if God exists.
Is it you're more confident that God exists than you are that anti-God exists?
Right, something like that. Or you're more likely that more likely that believing in God will result in the heaven or infinitely valued afterlife versus how likely that is on the anti-God hypothesis, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay.
And for some reason, that's how you decide between them. And since the credence in the God hypothesis is higher than the anti-God one, and compared to, say, other religions, if we want to argue in favor of like a Christian one, we have higher credence in this than the God of Islam or Judaism and so forth. Assuming those are different gods, then that would compel that belief or cultivation of belief.
I see. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see what would motivate the idea that you always go for the one with the highest probability, because I guess that principle wouldn't work in the finite case. So I'm just sort of wondering why you would think it should work in the infinite, in the case of infinite value. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe the motivation for it might just be that, well, intuitively there should be something to decide between these two, and that seems to be the only thing that could tease them apart. But
but why should there be something that decides between them? I guess
well, the idea might be something like this: like I have two actions that are okay, they both have infinite expected utility, but if one of them was very likely to result in the desired outcome, the other one was less likely to result in it, I don't know, plausibly the one that's more likely to result in it is preferable, even if by decision calculus both have infinite expected utility. But I don't know, spelling that out precisely in a way that sounds plausible is kind of difficult, but I'm somewhat against using infinities in the utility calculus anyway, but because there's other problems that you can get generated with those as well, but that's part of the idea anyway.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting. So I can see, no, I mean, I can see there is something plausible in that. If you say, yeah, exactly. So you go for, if option A, if there's a certain probability that option A will produce infinite utility and a higher probability that option B will produce infinite utility, that seems like a reason to go for option B.
Right.
I think that's right. Yeah. So you've got to think, you've got to, and of course, it is still going to give crazy results. Like, suppose there's a really, there's a tiny chance, there's a 1 in 10 to the minus 20 probability that A will produce infinite utility, and 10 to the minus 40 probability that B will produce infinite utility. So you go for option A. But actually, on the other hypothesis, in each case, A produces minus 1 million utility and B produces plus 1 million utility, let's say. So then it looks like on her principle, you've still got to go for option A, even though you're almost certain that option B will do better.
Yeah, actually, that's very similar to the problem that I presented to her in our discussion, which was that essentially comparing one action which is very unlikely to produce the infinitely valued outcome and very likely to produce a very negative but finitely valued outcome, versus another action which is certain to produce a very positive but finitely valued outcome. You're always no matter how small but non-zero the likelihood of the infinite expected outcome, you should always take the first option. Even though you're going to be, like, you could say this, like, you get heaven for eternity, or you get but most likely you're going to get hell for 10 trillion years. Versus the other option, which is certain to get heaven for 10 trillion years. You should take the first one. That just seems crazy, even if
that seems mad. And also to pay an arbitrary amount for that as well, presumably.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So my version was, the only way my version differs from yours is that in my version there were infinite payoffs in both options.
Right.
One of them, they were both very unlikely, but one of them made them slightly less unlikely. And on Hervey, presumably that's going to swamp the fact that the second option is much more likely to produce a really good outcome, and the first option is much more likely to produce a terrible outcome.
Right.
And yet you should pay arbitrary amounts to get the first one. So yeah, good. So what was her response to that?
I think she had a few different things to note. One, she did say that this is a serious issue. One of the things she said was that it could be that our intuitions are just wrong here, and that is the right result. Our intuitions go wrong in other decision problem cases, and maybe they also go wrong here.
No.
I think she was sympathetic to maybe it would have to be revised in some way. I recall her saying something else, but there were a couple of different options that maybe. Oh yes, there was another one which the other option was to, okay, let's not use an infinite expected utility here, but enormously large finite one, and maybe with the right credences you can still generate the same result and not have to deal with those problems.
Okay.
That was another option as well.
I see. So you imagine that belief, there's God and I mean, the problem with that, I guess, is that suppose you've got God and his, believing in him gives you finite utility X, which is big. I mean, supposing I have suppose I have I'm half as confident that anti-God exists, but anti-God gives me twice as much utility if I don't believe in God. So if you have finite, so I guess there are ways of making the anti-God problem come back if you have finite utilities.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess you could say that, well, it's not going to arise because my credences in those are going to be much smaller or something. Maybe.
Okay, I suppose it could. Yeah. I guess it depends on your intuitions, but I suppose. Yeah. So the point is, you can have. It's got to be so much smaller that it's got to compensate for the additional utility got from not believing in God, and it's not clear why that should be so.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it could be. Maybe it could be.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's gonna. I could definitely imagine someone though for whom this sort of reasoning is compelling, right? They do have the right sort of credences and preferences such that it is rational for them to try to cultivate a belief in God and so forth. But well, I'm not one of them, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, it would have to be. You can see why it would work. It wouldn't have a sort of a priori force that it was supposed to have. There'd be lots of people that it wouldn't work on. Whereas in the infinite case, I imagine it does have it has the infinite case is supposed to work for anyone who's got any non-zero degree of belief in this being. Whereas for this case, suppose there's some X, finite X, such that belief in God, if he exists, gives you utility X. It's only going to work for people who've got sufficiently high credence in that hypothesis. So that it's going to have, the lower you make it, the more plausible, the narrower the scope of the argument, I think.
All right. Yeah, that seems good to me. There's more to discuss on that, and maybe she'll write some more on that. But I did want to wrap up in a minute or two, and I like to end off with, I don't think we did the last time, a question, kind of metaphilosophical question. What do you think about the like the value of philosophy? I guess to you, but also to society in general. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think. Well, there are several things to say. One thing is that, I mean, I do philosophy, I guess, because I really like it. I've always loved it. Have certain kinds of curiosity about certain questions. You want to have them answered, and that matters to me. So that's my reason for doing it. In terms of the value that it can give to society or why it matters, it can matter as a sort of intellectual training, and it can matter for people who care about these things. Anyone who cares about important issues, can benefit from having some sort of philosophical education. It can shape your view of life and other things just through thinking about basic questions. You get a vision of what human beings are, what their place is in the universe. That can have a bearing on your views about value. Your views about what value is can change things. So it can change the sort of person you are, the way you treat other people, the way you think about all kinds of questions. I mean, just to give one example, the way I think about many political questions, because I have a sort of roughly Humean view about many things, is that a lot of them, there isn't a right answer. They're just people have different preferences, and there's no answer to the question. Real life questions often involve trade-offs between liberty and security, or between economic growth and equality, and different people trade those things off at different rates. Those are facts about their preferences. There's no right answer because, again, this is a Humean point. There are relatively few constraints on what preferences are right. Preferences are not, they can't be true or false in the way that beliefs can. So when you get into arguments with people about these things, you don't think you're arguing over something to which there's a right answer. And that can make you tolerant. It means that you can enter into some of these discussions and understand these disputes in a spirit, I think, that can make you more tolerant of others and gives you a different idea of what so-called disagreement about these matters consists in. So that's one way in which I think philosophy, for me in particular, in which philosophy has shaped my view about certain things. In terms of its broader value, of course, it encourages a questioning attitude. It discourages, trust of authority, especially epistemic trust of authority. It makes people think for themselves, which I think is the most important thing that education can do. So for all those reasons, I think, a lot of philosophy, philosophy could be taught at an earlier age and could actually be very helpful in that connection. So those say some of the things about why philosophy, I think, is useful and important. And its value for me. I mean, I could say more things in specific about particular detailed doctrines, but as a broad picture, I guess that covers it.
Yeah, very, very good. That's excellent. So yeah, I think we'll end the questions there. I'd like to thank you again for being here and taking my questions and providing your very thoughtful responses. It's been great having you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.